In the year 1582, the provincial domains of Japan were still settling into the long aftermath of a century of internal war. The capital at Kyoto remained the ceremonial heart of the imperial system, though the court itself had long since ceased to hold any meaningful administrative authority. The work of governing, such as it was, had passed into the hands of successive warlords, who each, in turn, claimed to act in the emperor's name while pursuing ends that were entirely their own. By the time the warlord Oda Nobunaga fell at Honnoji that year, struck down by a subordinate general named Akechi Mitsuhide, the country had grown accustomed to the idea that power was not a thing to be inherited calmly, but seized, defended, and often surrendered violently. The transition from one dominant house to another had become, over the course of several generations, almost procedural. Japan, in the late 16th century, was organized around a set of institutions that had evolved considerably from their continental origins. The military aristocracy, the samurai class, occupied a formal position above all other social categories, and this position was maintained through a combination of legal statute, custom, and the ever-present reality of armed force. Beneath the samurai were the farmers, the artisans, and the merchants, each assigned a defined social rank that was increasingly codified as the century wore on. This rigidity was, in part, a response to the preceding era of instability when the boundaries between classes had blurred and men of humble origin had risen to command armies and administer provinces. The new order, such as it was being constructed in the final decades of the 16th century, sought to prevent such mobility from occurring again. The period known as the Sengoku, the era of warring states, had lasted, depending on how one measured its beginning, for over a century by the time its formal close was approaching. During those decades, the authority of the Ashikaga shogunate, established in Kyoto in the mid-14th century, had eroded until the shogun exercised more ceremonial than practical power, and the great daimyo, the territorial lords who governed the provinces, had pursued their rivalries without reference to any higher authority. Alliances were made and dissolved within the span of a season. Castles changed hands repeatedly. Families that had occupied a province for generations were extinguished in a single engagement or a single act of betrayal, and new houses rose from the most unlikely origins to control vast territories. The instability was systemic rather than exceptional, and the culture of the period had organized itself around its requirements. The province of Harima, situated in what is now the western portion of Hyogo Prefecture, was one of many domains through which these broader transformations passed almost imperceptibly. It was agricultural country, cut through by rivers, and framed by low mountains, and its towns and villages carried the ordinary texture of provincial life. Local markets, small temples and shrines, seasonal labor in the paddies, and the periodic movement of soldiers whose campaigns traced across the landscape without altering it in any lasting way. Harima had passed through multiple periods of contested control during the wars of the previous century, and its population had developed the particular quality of resilience that belongs to people who have learned to accommodate whoever holds power without becoming wholly shaped by any one of them. Religion in this period was neither singular nor coherent. Buddhism had been the dominant institutional faith for centuries, organized into a range of competing sects whose monasteries controlled land, wealth, and in some cases military strength. The Tendai establishment on Mount Hiei, overlooking Kyoto, had maintained a network of temples and affiliated institutions that gave it considerable political influence, while the Pure Land sects and the Zen establishments each developed their own institutional forms and their own relationships with the secular powers. Shinto practice continued alongside Buddhism, rooted in local shrines and the veneration of place-specific deities that had their own calendars of ceremony and their own networks of priestly families. Popular religion involved a wide range of practices that drew on both traditions as well as older animistic and shamanic elements that had never been fully systematized. Nobunaga's burning of the Enryakuji temple complex on Mount Hiei in 1571 remained a vivid and recent memory, not simply as an act of military violence against a religious institution, but as evidence of the degree to which religious establishments had become entangled in the military politics of the era. And the relationship between religious organizations and secular power was one of ongoing renegotiation. Martial culture in this era was undergoing its own reorganization. The battlefield of the 16th century had relied heavily on massed infantry formations, the ashigaru, who wielded long spears called naginata and yari in coordinated strikes rather than individual combat. Firearms, introduced by Portuguese traders in 1543, had been integrated into Japanese military practice with remarkable speed, and, by the time of the great battles of the period, they were a decisive element of any large engagement. The individual swordsman, the duelist, the master of hand-to-hand combat, these figures retained their cultural prestige, but their practical role on the battlefield had shifted substantially. Nonetheless, the sword remained the symbolic weapon of the samurai, and skill with it was still the primary credential of martial identity. The wearing of two swords, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi, was the defining visual mark of samurai status, and the art of drawing and using the sword was cultivated as both practical skill and ritual form. The schools of swordsmanship, the Ryu, had multiplied across the country during this period, each claiming descent from a founding master and each articulating its own system of technique, philosophy, and training method. The Shinto Ryu, founded in the late 15th century by Aizasa Choisai Ienao, was among the oldest and most respected. The Kage-ryu and its derivatives had spread through the eastern provinces. The Yagyu Shinkage-ryu had established itself as the preferred school of the Tokugawa family. Some of these schools were associated with particular houses and served essentially as official martial programs for their retainers. Others were independent, their masters traveling from domain to domain, offering instruction in exchange for patronage or fees. The transmission of technique was typically personal and hierarchical. Students received instruction from a master over years or decades, and the formal awarding of certificates signified not merely skill, but membership in a lineage. This system created a world in which martial authority was tied closely to personal reputation, and in which a practitioner's standing depended in large measure on outcomes that could not be falsified. The relationship between practical combat and formalized practice was, in this period, less resolved than it would later become. A practitioner might have occasion to use his training in an actual encounter, whether a formally arranged duel, a street confrontation, or a military engagement, and the outcome of such encounters carried real consequences for his reputation and sometimes for his continued existence. The challenge match, in which one practitioner formally requested an encounter with another, typically at a location and time agreed upon in advance, was a recognized institution with its own protocol, and the outcomes of such matches were noted and discussed within the networks of the martial community. The practitioner who avoided challenges or who accepted them and did poorly lost standing in a way that formal certificates of skill could not compensate. Reputation in this world was experiential before it was institutional. It was into this world, this specific arrangement of institutions, hierarchies, martial customs, and contested political authority, that a child named Shinmen Benosuke was born, most likely in the year 1584, in Harima Province. The circumstances of his birth and early years are partially obscured, as is common for figures of this period whose fame was consolidated in retrospect rather than recorded in the moment. What can be established with reasonable confidence is that he was born into a family with martial credentials, that his early environment was shaped by the expectations and routines of the samurai class, and that the world around him was one in which armed conflict was not a distant abstraction, but an ordinary, if irregularly distributed, feature of life. His father was a man known as Shinmen Munisai, or by some accounts Miyamoto Musashi, a practitioner of both the sword and the jita, the short iron truncheon used in close-quarters engagement. Musashi had sufficient skill and reputation to have attracted the attention of the Shinmen clan, a powerful local house under which he served, and it was from this connection that the family name Shinmen was derived. He had been formally recognized as an accomplished martial artist, and there are accounts, preserved in family records and later biographical sources, that he received acknowledgment for his skill from the Ashikaga shogunate, though the reliability of such claims varies considerably depending on the source. What is more certain is that Musashi occupied a defined position within local martial culture and that his household carried the expectations associated with such a position. He was a man who had organized his life around the practice and transmission of martial skill, and who would have understood his son's existence primarily in relation to those same categories. The circumstances of Benosuke's mother remain largely unrecorded in the sources that survive. What records suggest is that she died when the child was quite young, and that his father's household was therefore not the primary setting for his childhood. The dissolution of the family unit in these circumstances was managed through the institutional resources available, which in provincial Japan of this period meant primarily the network of extended family and the local religious establishments. There are accounts suggesting Benosuke was raised at least in part by an uncle, a man associated with the Shorien temple at Miyamoto, and that the temple environment provided some part of his early education and formation. This is a pattern not uncommon in the period. Children of disrupted households finding a degree of institutional care in local religious establishments, which functioned as educational centers as well as places of worship and community gathering. The village of Miyamoto in Mimasaka province appears in later accounts as the place most strongly associated with his early years, and it is from this place that the name by which he would later be known, Miyamoto Musashi, was drawn. The adoption of a place name as a personal identifier was common in this period and reflected the importance of territorial connection as a component of identity. To be Miyamoto Musashi was to be identified with a particular piece of ground, a village in the mountains of Mimasaka, and whatever associations that ground carried, its temple, its landscape, the community whose ordinary rhythms had shaped the earliest years of his life. Mimasaka was a mountainous inland province, less agriculturally productive than the coastal lowlands, but nonetheless occupied and administered its small towns and rural communities following the rhythms of farming and seasonal ceremony. The landscape shaped certain habits, attentiveness to path and passage, an understanding of how geography constrains movement, the particular quality of physical awareness that comes from living in country where one's footing must always be considered. The separation from his father appears to have been a permanent feature of his early life rather than a temporary circumstance. Musashi and Benosuke do not appear in the same records during the child's early years, and the accounts that survive suggest a distance, possibly estrangement, between them. This detail, preserved in various forms across biographical traditions, is noted without elaboration in most primary sources, and its weight must be inferred rather than stated. What it produced, in practical terms, was a childhood and early adolescence in which the boy was not subject to the direct daily supervision of his father, and in which the formation of his character and habits took place in a more dispersed set of influences. The temple, the rural community, the uncles and relatives who constituted the extended family. Each contributed something to the environment in which the child's habits and orientations were formed. Musashi himself, writing in his final years, does not speak directly about his childhood. What he records in the opening passages of what would become the Gorin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings, is a statement of facts about his martial practice, the number of his duels, the age at which he began, the course of his development as he understood it from the vantage of old age. He notes that he had his first serious encounter at the age of 13, and that by the time he was 28 or 29, he believed himself to have understood something essential about the way of the sword, though that understanding had come not from any single revelation, but from the accumulated evidence of his encounters. There is no sentiment in these passages, no narrative of origin that reaches back before the first moment of practice. He begins with what he had done, not with where he had come from, and this quality of presentation, the self understood primarily through practice rather than through circumstance, is characteristic of the text as a whole. The education available to a boy of samurai background in a provincial setting in the late 16th century was shaped primarily by the institutions and persons close at hand. Reading and writing in the classical style, some familiarity with Buddhist texts and Chinese classical literature, the basic physical disciplines of martial training. These were the expected elements. The formal system of temples as educational centers meant that a child placed in such an environment would encounter texts, calligraphy practice, and the intellectual culture of the Buddhist establishment alongside the more ordinary routines of the religious community. How deeply any of this entered Musashi's early formation is difficult to establish. What is evident from his later writing is that he was not entirely without literary education. The Gorin no Sho demonstrates familiarity with classical forms and with the philosophical traditions of his era, but that his primary mode of engagement with the world was never primarily textual. What is more clearly attested is that by some point in his early adolescence, possibly as young as 13, Musashi had already begun practicing with the sword in a way that went beyond the ordinary exercises of martial training. The first recorded instance of a duel against a man named Arima Kihei, a practitioner of the Shinto Ryu school who had posted a public challenge near the village of Hirafuku, belongs to this period. The challenge was public and formal. Musashi responded to it, and the encounter ended with the death of Arima Kihei at the hands of a boy who could not yet have completed any formal course of martial instruction. The reliability of the specific details surrounding this event has been questioned by historians, and the age of 13 is almost certainly a retrospective attribution shaped by biographical convention. What the account preserves, however, is the beginning of a recognizable pattern. The young practitioner seeking out encounters, testing himself against trained adults, and emerging from these encounters with a record of survival that would eventually become the foundation of his reputation. In the years that followed this first recorded encounter, Musashi appears to have remained in the provincial environment of his childhood rather than attaching himself to a military household in any formal capacity. The training of a young swordsman in this period typically involved one of two paths: either formal enrollment in a recognized school, usually arranged through family or patronage connections, or the more informal and irregular process of independent practice supplemented by challenge, matches against whoever would accept. Musashi's situation was one in which the second path was more available to him than the first. He was not, insofar as the records suggest, enrolled in any of the established schools of the period. His training was his own to organize, and the habits he developed during these years, the emphasis on direct experience over formal instruction, the testing of principle against actual encounter rather than classroom exercise, would remain the defining features of his martial philosophy throughout his life. The physical practice of sword training in this period was organized around forms, the kata, which encoded the principles of engagement in sequences of movement performed either alone or with a partner. The kata were not simply exercises in physical conditioning, but transmissions of knowledge, each movement carrying a meaning that the practitioner was expected to understand as well as reproduce. A student who merely copied the surface of the form without grasping its underlying logic was considered to have only partial knowledge, and the senior practitioners of most schools were explicit in their expectation that understanding would develop alongside repetition over years of practice. The concept of the kata as a vehicle of knowledge rather than merely a physical routine was fundamental to how martial education was conceived in this period, and it created a tradition in which the relationship between form and principle was always a subject of reflection among serious practitioners. His daily routine during the years of early practice had the structure that sustained physical training imposes on its own. Rising early, the first hours of the morning given to practice with wooden weapons, the bakken, the training sword, in forms performed with the kind of attention that repetition makes possible only after a long period of initial confusion. The midday hours might involve study, observation of others practicing, or additional physical work of various kinds. The evening hours returning to practice, or to the quieter work of reflection on what the day's practice had revealed. This rhythm, practice, observation, reflection, return to practice, was not unique to martial training but was the general pattern of serious physical education in any tradition, and it produced over years and decades the kind of deep familiarity with the material that could not be acquired through any shorter or more concentrated process. The confrontation between Tokugawa Ieyasu and the remaining supporters of the Toyotomi house built across 1599 and into 1600, and it resolved itself in October of that year at the Battle of Sekigahara, a large engagement in the mountains of Mino province that drew in armies from across the country and lasted, in its decisive phase, a single day. Musashi, then approximately 16 years of age, appears in some accounts as having been present at Sekigahara, fighting on the western, Toyotomi-aligned side. The specific evidence for this is thin, and historians have approached it with varying degrees of skepticism. What is more plausible is that he participated in the broader regional mobilizations of the period in some capacity, given his age, background, and the general practice of the time, whereby young men of samurai families joined military contingents even before formal enrollment in any household service. For a young man of Musashi's background, without strong attachment to any particular house, without the patronage network that might have absorbed him into a domain's service and associated with the losing side of the Sekigahara divide, the period following 1600 offered few clear institutional paths. The great households were reorganizing their retainer bands, rewarding loyalty and excluding those whose affiliations were uncertain or adverse. The martial culture of the period continued to produce practitioners seeking to advance. Their reputations and the challenge match remained a functioning institution for establishing standing. It was in this context that Musashi began what he later described as a period of continuous travel and encounter, the Musha Shugyo, or warrior's pilgrimage, in which a practitioner tested himself against opponents from different schools and backgrounds across the provinces. The Musha Shugyo was not an institution in any formal sense, but rather a practice with recognized cultural meaning. A practitioner who undertook such a journey was understood to be seeking the kind of education that could not be acquired within a single school or under a single master. The direct experience of different fighting styles, different bodies and temperaments, different conditions of engagement. The formal transmission of a single school, however thorough, could produce a practitioner who was highly skilled within the parameters of that school's assumptions but was unable to adapt when those assumptions did not hold. The traveler who moved from region to region and school to school was acquiring, in each encounter, information about the limits of his own training and about the principles that transcended any particular system. The road system of Japan in the early 17th century was developing rapidly under the Tokugawa administration, which required reliable communication and the movement of tribute goods, but travel remained a significant undertaking. The post stations that lined the major routes, the Tokaido along the Pacific coast, the Nakasendo through the mountains, provided accommodation and staging points, but the journey between them was still accomplished on foot, carrying whatever one needed for the road. A traveler without permanent institutional attachment would have moved through this landscape, carrying his weapons, managing his expenses carefully, and seeking out the martial networks in each province that might provide opponents, conversation, and the kind of informal information exchange about practitioners and schools that constituted the intelligence network of the martial world. His daily routine during this period of travel had the structure that long journeys impose. The post stations and inns of the major routes provided food and lodging at established prices, and a traveler without permanent attachment to any household would have managed his expenses carefully. Morning practice, which for a serious martial artist meant extended repetition of forms, regardless of the previous day's travel, would have been the first priority before any other engagement with the day. The physical demands of travel on foot, 10, 15, 20 miles depending on the route and the terrain, kept the body in a state of continuous conditioning that supplemented rather than replaced the more focused work of formal practice. The varied environments of travel, different ground, different weather, different qualities of light and air, produced a kind of embodied knowledge of adaptation that no single training environment could replicate. Musashi wrote later that he had never, during the period of his active practice, subordinated his martial training to any other consideration, however pressing the circumstances might have made other demands. The meals were taken when available, the lodgings accepted as they came, but the training was constant. Musashi's encounters with the practitioners of the Yoshioka school, one of the most prominent martial schools in Kyoto during this period, are among the most fully documented episodes of his early career. The Yoshioka family had served as instructors to the Ashikaga shoguns and retained considerable prestige from that association even as the Ashikaga house itself declined. Their school was established in Kyoto and drew students from across the region, and the family's reputation was maintained through a combination of formal credentials, the quality of their instruction, and the outcomes of the challenge matches they participated in. By the time of Musashi's arrival in Kyoto, probably around 1604, when he was approximately 20 years old, the Yoshioka school was led by brothers who had inherited both the family's reputation and its institutional position. His passage through Kyoto brought him into contact not only with martial schools, but with the broader cultural environment of the old capital. Kyoto, in the early 17th century, was still the center of Japan's artistic and intellectual culture. The tea ceremony, no drama, poetry, calligraphy, and painting all had their primary practitioners and institutions in or near the city. The Tokugawa administration had made Edo its political capital, but it had not yet created the conditions for a robust cultural life in the new city, and the old aristocratic and ecclesiastical networks of Kyoto continued to support the arts in their traditional forms. A traveler with any degree of sensitivity to his surroundings would have encountered this cultural environment, the temples, gardens, and artistic establishments of the city, and accumulated impressions that might or might not find expression later. The development of the two-sword style, which Musashi called Niten Ichi Ryu, the school of two heavens as one, was not a sudden invention but an accumulation that drew on the observations of many encounters. The conventional approach to the Japanese sword used both hands on the grip to maximize the power and precision of each cut, organizing the body's force into a single decisive instrument. The two-sword approach sacrificed some of that concentration of force in order to multiply the practitioner's options at every moment of engagement. With a weapon in each hand, the practitioner could attack and defend simultaneously, could present threats in multiple directions, and could maintain engagement with an opponent who sought to use distance as a defense against the longer weapon. The approach required a different management of body mechanics and balance. The center of gravity shifted, the movement patterns changed, the reading of the opponent's intentions became more complex because the opponent's attention had to be divided between two sources of threat rather than one. The encounter at Ganryujima with Sasaki Kojiro, which took place in the spring of 1612, occurred at a moment when Musashi's reputation in the western provinces had reached a point where the encounter had genuine significance for the regional martial hierarchy. Sasaki Kojiro was, by this time, the senior martial instructor to the Hosokawa domain, a position that placed him firmly within the patronage system of one of the most powerful houses in Kyushu. He had developed a reputation for a distinctive technique involving a long sword and an overhead cut of unusual speed and reach, and his standing within the regional martial community was substantial, enough that a challenge from outside the domain's network was an event of some institutional weight. The encounter was formally arranged, with witnesses present and the location and time agreed upon in advance, an island in the strait between the provinces of Buzen and Nagato near the city of Kokura. The particulars of the encounter at Ganryujima have been subject to more elaboration than perhaps any other episode in Musashi's life. The account of his deliberately late arrival, of his having carved a wooden weapon from an oar during the boat journey to the island, and of the single exchange that ended the contest. These elements have been repeated across centuries of retelling and have entered deeply into the popular understanding of Musashi as a figure. The deliberate late arrival, if it occurred, would have been a calculated act of psychological pressure. Forcing an opponent to wait is a technique for disturbing composure, and a practitioner who allows impatience to alter his state before the encounter begins has already conceded something. The specific claim that he fashioned his weapon from an oar during the crossing is improbable on practical grounds and may represent a later accretion to what was originally a simpler account. What the various sources agree on is that the encounter occurred, that it was witnessed formally, and that Sasaki Kojiro died from the injuries he received. Musashi continued his travels following the encounter at Ganryujima, moving through Kyushu and eventually back toward the main island of Honshu. The decade that followed 1612 is not documented in the same detail as the years of his most active challenge-seeking, and the biographical record for this period is thinner and more fragmented. He appears to have engaged in fewer formal challenge encounters during these years and to have shifted his attention increasingly toward the activities associated with a practitioner who was transitioning from the phase of testing toward the phase of teaching and reflection. He accepted students in various locations, offered instruction on an informal basis, and began the work of articulating his approach in a more systematic form. The broader political environment in which he was operating had been transformed by the events of 1615. The Osaka campaigns of that year, the winter campaign of 1614 and the summer campaign of 1615, brought the long unresolved tension between the Tokugawa shogunate and the remnant Toyotomi forces to its final resolution. Toyotomi Hideyori, the son for whose benefit the Toyotomi loyalists had maintained their position at Osaka Castle, died in the castle's fall, and with him died the political alternative to Tokugawa supremacy that had been preserved since Sekigahara. Musashi participated in the summer campaign of 1615 in some capacity. The records are not precise about his role. On the Tokugawa side, reflecting either a genuine reorientation of his political position or simply the practical calculation that the outcome of Sekigahara had foreclosed other options. The Osaka campaigns ended an era of political uncertainty and inaugurated the long peace of the Tokugawa period, which would last until the mid-19th century. His periods of residence in Edo during the 1620s placed him within the developing cultural environment of the new administrative capital. Edo was growing rapidly under the demands of the Sankin Kotai system that required all daimyo to maintain residences there and to spend alternating years in the city and in their home provinces. This movement of people and wealth into Edo was creating a new urban culture, distinct in character from the older aristocratic culture of Kyoto, and the martial schools that followed the daimyo retinues to Edo were establishing themselves within this new environment. Musashi's reputation, established through decades of encounter, gave him a standing in this environment that did not depend on formal, institutional affiliation, and he was received by practitioners of various schools with the combination of respect and wariness that a figure of his particular history naturally attracted. The relationship between martial practice and other arts was a subject Musashi returned to repeatedly in his later writing. He had observed that the skills required for excellence in any serious discipline shared certain features regardless of the specific content of that discipline. The carpenter who understands the properties of wood, who can read the grain, judge the strength, anticipate how different materials will respond to the tools applied to them, has developed a knowledge that goes beyond the accumulation of specific techniques. The calligrapher who has mastered the brush, who can feel the response of the paper to the ink, who can produce the line that the character requires without deliberation, has developed a similar depth of embodied understanding. And the swordsman who has genuinely grasped the principles of engagement, who can read the situation, judge the opponent's intention, and respond without the delay that conscious calculation introduces, has achieved something analogous in a different medium. The Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 and 1638 drew Musashi again into military service. The rebellion, a peasant and Christian uprising on the Shimabara Peninsula of Kyushu, produced a large military mobilization by the shogunate, and Musashi was present as a senior advisor or instructor within the forces assembled to suppress it. An account from this period describes his being struck in the leg by a stone thrown from the walls of the rebel fortification, a detail that is specific enough to have been recorded at the time rather than invented later, producing an injury that did not incapacitate him permanently but may have contributed to the health difficulties of his later years. The rebellion was suppressed with considerable violence, and the shogunate's response to it resulted in further tightening of the restrictions on Christianity and on foreign contact that would define Japan's foreign policy for the following 2 centuries. The Hosokawa domain in Kumamoto was among the wealthiest and most culturally active domains in Kyushu. Its castle town had developed the character of a provincial cultural center, with schools, temples, and the infrastructure of artistic and intellectual life that a wealthy domain's patronage could sustain. Musashi arrived in Kumamoto in 1640 at approximately 56 years of age, old by the standards of his era and already experiencing some of the physical changes that serious age brings. The vigor of his earlier years had been replaced by a different quality, not weakness exactly, but the settled competence of someone who has done a thing so many times that the effort involved in doing it has become nearly invisible. His daily life in Kumamoto had a regularity that his decades of travel had not permitted. He rose early, practiced according to routines that had been his constant for 40-odd years, and spent the morning hours in the work of instruction or reflection. He met with Lord Tadatoshi regularly, conversations that ranged across martial strategy, philosophy, and the arts. He received students, assessed their progress, and offered corrections and observations. In the afternoons, he painted. The ink brush work that had been developing alongside his martial practice for years, and that in these conditions of stability could be pursued with greater consistency and depth. The evenings were quiet, and the quality of that quietness, after decades in which the night had been spent in unfamiliar inns or on the road, was itself something to attend to. The death of Hosokawa Tadatoshi in 1641 removed Musashi's primary patron. The domain continued to maintain him with the same respect and material support that Tadatoshi had established, but the personal relationship that had given the arrangement its particular quality was gone. Tadatoshi had been, in the accounts preserved in Hosokawa records, genuinely engaged with Musashi's thinking, asking questions, participating in discussions, treating the older man not merely as a social ornament, but as an intellectual interlocutor whose observations mattered to him. The loss of this relationship appears to have coincided with a period of withdrawal from active instructional work and the beginning of a more intensive focus on the writing and reflection that would eventually produce the Gorin no Sho. The condition of his health in the years following 1641 was deteriorating in ways that the available sources describe obliquely. He complained of fatigue and physical difficulty in ways that were inconsistent with the ordinary effects of aging alone. The specific nature of his illness cannot be determined with precision at this distance, but the progression of his symptoms, weakness, difficulty breathing, gradual withdrawal from physical exertion, is consistent with a serious systemic condition rather than the ordinary accumulation of the effects of age and the injuries of a long physical life. He continued to paint, continued to write, and continued to receive students and visitors, but the range of his activity was narrowing as his strength diminished. His response to this diminishment was to increase rather than reduce the seriousness of his attention. The Gorin no Sho was begun in these years, the effort to set down in writing what he had spent 60 years accumulating through practice. The project was demanding precisely because the knowledge to be transmitted was not primarily verbal. It had been acquired through the body, refined through encounter, and existed primarily as a capacity for response rather than a set of propositions. The challenge of translating that knowledge into language without falsifying it was one that Musashi approached, with the same directness he brought to every other challenge. The Gorin no Sho as a text is organized with a care that reflects the seriousness of its compositional intention. The 5 sections proceed from the most general to the most particular in some respects, and from the practical to the philosophical in others. The Earth section establishes the framework within which the subsequent sections are to be read. The idea of strategy as a way that can be practiced and understood through the same kind of sustained attention that any other discipline requires. The water section describes the technical content of the Niten Ichi Ryu, the specific cuts, positions, and movements of the school, in terms that emphasize their underlying logic rather than their surface form. The fire section addresses the dynamics of actual engagement, the management of timing, spacing, and the psychological dimensions of combat. The wind section examines other schools, identifying what Musashi considered their characteristic errors The excessive attention to aesthetic refinement at the expense of practical effectiveness, the overvaluation of a single technique, the confusion between the demonstration of skill and its actual employment. The void section, brief and elliptical, gestures toward a dimension of practice that the preceding sections have prepared for but cannot fully contain. Shortly before his death, in the same period of concentrated work at Reigando, he also composed the Dokodo, the Path of Aloneness, or the Way of Walking Alone. The Dokodo is a different kind of text from the Gorin no Sho, more personal, less concerned with martial technique, more directly addressed to the question of how a life should be conducted. Its 21 precepts are stated without elaboration or qualification, each one a compressed statement of a principle by which he had attempted to live. Among them, do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Do not act in contravention of the customs of society. Do not become attached to a single weapon. Do not covet anything that belongs to the way. Do not be jealous. Accept separation from every person. As a collection, the precepts describe an orientation toward life that values independence above comfort, clarity above relationship, and the practice itself above any of the social goods that practice might be used to acquire. The immediate response within the Hosokawa domain was one of appropriate institutional acknowledgement. Musashi had been a figure of genuine significance within the domain's martial and cultural life, and his death was marked with the ceremonies and observations that such significance warranted. He was buried in the vicinity of the Kumamoto area, though the specific location has been a subject of scholarly discussion given the existence of multiple sites with claims to contain his remains. The ambiguity of the burial location is itself a characteristic detail in the biography of figures who attracted devotion in the centuries after their deaths. The competition for authentic connection to a revered figure producing claims that cannot always be resolved through the available evidence. The Gorin no Sho circulated initially within the limited network of those who had direct connection to Musashi or to his school. Its transmission followed the path that important texts in Japan typically followed. Manuscript copies, carefully made, passed through the network of students and affiliated practitioners, gradually reaching readers whose connection to the original source was more distant. The text was eventually printed in the early 19th century, and its subsequent circulation beyond Japan, beginning in the 20th century and accelerating considerably in the latter half of that century, placed it in a category of texts that had achieved a form of global recognition. The mid-20th century context of Japan's rapid economic development produced a reading of the Gorin no Sho as primarily a text about competitive strategy in contexts well beyond martial practice, a reading facilitated by certain features of the text's language and structure, but departing from the martial and philosophical orientation of its original composition. The figure of Miyamoto Musashi, as it has been transmitted through Japanese culture over the 4 centuries since his death, has been shaped substantially by forces that had little to do with the historical record. The most influential single work in constructing the popular image was the novel by Yoshikawa Eiji, serialized between 1935 and 1939, which dramatized Musashi's life in a form accessible to a mass readership and embedded in the narrative structures of popular romance and heroic biography. The Yoshikawa novel introduced generations of readers to a Musashi who was as much a creation of early 20th century literary sensibility as a reflection of historical fact, and it remains the primary reference point for the popular understanding of the figure, even among readers who are unaware of the degree to which it departs from what the historical sources support. The historical Musashi, as distinguished from the literary and cultural construct, is a more uncertain figure, not less interesting for that uncertainty, but more provisional, more dependent on inference, and more constrained in what can be claimed about the interior of his experience. The duels are documented, the travels are attested, the writing is preserved, the daily texture of his life, the particular quality of his attention during the years of practice, the thoughts that accompanied the making of the ink paintings, the experience of the cave during the final years of reflection. These are inaccessible through the surviving sources, available only as inference from the broader patterns of his life and from the documents that remain. The broader influence of Musashi's approach, the emphasis on principle over form, on adaptability over fixed technique, on the direct experience of actual engagement over the repetition of established kata, continued to be present in Japanese martial culture in ways that are difficult to trace with precision because they represent dispositions that arise independently in any serious martial tradition. What his writing contributed was a sustained, articulate expression of these dispositions in a form that could be read, discussed, and debated, a conceptual vocabulary that made certain ways of thinking about martial practice more accessible to practitioners who came after him. The sword as an object had, by the time of Musashi's death, already begun the transition from weapon to cultural symbol that would become one of the defining features of samurai identity in the Tokugawa period. The peace that the Tokugawa order had established removed the military context in which the sword had been primarily a practical instrument and replaced it with a ceremonial context in which the sword marked social standing and expressed values that were increasingly philosophical rather than tactical. In this context, the philosophical dimension of Musashi's approach, his insistence on understanding the principle behind the technique, was consistent with the direction in which martial culture was moving, even though his own formation had occurred in a period when the sword was still used in earnest. The cave at Reigando has been preserved as a site of commemoration. Visitors continue to come to the hillside above Iwato, climbing the path through the trees to the opening in the rock where the old practitioner sat and wrote during the final months of his life. The interior of the cave is unelaborated, rock and earth, the sound of water nearby, the light varying with the hours and the season. The site sits in a landscape that retains something of the character it would have had in the 17th century, not unchanged, but not entirely transformed either. The quality of silence and natural enclosure relatively persistent across the interval. It is a place where the relationship between a man and the physical conditions of his final work is still, in some measure, legible. In the final passages of the Dokodo, written in what appear to have been among the last days of his life in the cave, there is a statement that the practice of the way requires no teacher and no scripture, only sustained attention and the willingness to examine through direct experience whatever arises. Whether it is fully accurate as a description of how Musashi actually developed, he clearly drew on teachers, texts, and the experience of others at various points in his life, or whether it represents something more like an aspiration, an expression of what the practice aimed at in its ideal form, is a question that remains with the document. The text does not resolve it. The hills around Kumamoto were quiet in the spring of 1645. The cherry trees bloomed. The path leading down from the cave continued in both directions, as paths do. The intellectual framework within which Musashi operated was not primarily Buddhist, though Buddhism shaped the cultural environment of his entire life, and certain Buddhist concepts appear in his writing. The Zen tradition, which had been deeply integrated into the martial culture of the samurai class since the Kamakura period several centuries earlier, provided a vocabulary for the relationship between sustained practice and the attainment of a quality of mind that transcended deliberate calculation. The Zen concept of mushin, the mind without obstruction, the state of mental clarity in which response arises without the delay of conscious deliberation, was a concept that martial practitioners had found directly applicable to the conditions of combat. A practitioner who had to think about each movement could be defeated by the interval between perception and response. A practitioner who had trained to the point where the response arose without that interval had achieved something qualitatively different, and the Zen tradition provided both a conceptual framework for understanding what that something was and a set of practices oriented toward its cultivation. The Confucian dimension of the intellectual culture of his period was also present, if in a more ambient and less articulated way. The reorganization of Japanese society that the Tokugawa shogunate was undertaking during Musashi's adult years drew heavily on Confucian principles of social order. The emphasis on hierarchy, on the proper fulfillment of roles, on the cultivation of virtue through adherence to established norms. The Neo-Confucian philosophy that would eventually become the official intellectual framework of the Tokugawa state was still in the process of being adopted and systematized in Musashi's time, but its basic orientations were already influencing the way educated people in Japan understood the relationship between individual cultivation and social order. Musashi's own framework diverged from Confucian social conservatism in certain respects, his emphasis on independence, his skepticism about inherited forms, his preference for direct experience over transmitted tradition. But the vocabulary of cultivation and of the way was one he shared with the Confucian tradition. The way, the do in Japanese, the Tao in the Chinese tradition from which it derived, was a concept with a long and complex history that Musashi used in a specifically martial context while maintaining its broader philosophical resonances. The way of the sword was, for Musashi, an instance of a more general category, the way of any discipline pursued with sufficient seriousness that the practitioner's engagement with it became a form of self-understanding. The carpenter, the painter, the physician, each pursuing a way that, if followed with genuine commitment, would produce both practical mastery and something harder to name, a quality of understanding that went beyond the specific domain of the practice itself. This universalizing tendency in Musashi's thinking was not mere philosophical abstraction, but a product of his specific experience. The observations he had made across 40 years of practice that certain qualities recurred in every serious discipline regardless of its content. The challenge of the unattached practitioner was not only social, but material. Without the stipend that domain service provided, the income required to sustain practice and travel had to be obtained through other means, through fees for instruction, through the occasional patronage of wealthy individuals who valued association with a figure of known reputation, through the production and sale of works of art, as his skills in that area developed. The economics of this existence are rarely discussed in the biographical tradition, which tends to present Musashi's material circumstances as essentially unproblematic, but the reality was that sustaining the kind of continuous practice he pursued required a steady management of resources that was not automatic. The frugality that the Dokodo's precepts recommend, the indifference to luxury, the willingness to accept whatever material conditions presented themselves, may reflect not only philosophical orientation, but the practical necessity of a life conducted without institutional support. The encounter with Hosokawa Tadatoshi in 1640 resolved this tension not by abolishing it, but by finding a form of attachment that Musashi could accept and that the domain could maintain with dignity. Tadatoshi did not ask Musashi to become a regular retainer in the way that younger men in the domain's service were retainers, subject to daily administrative requirements, their time managed by the household's practical needs. What he offered was a relationship of patronage in which The practitioner's independence was preserved within a framework of mutual respect. The domain provided material security. The practitioner provided instruction, conversation, and the cultural prestige that his presence conferred on the house. This arrangement was not without precedent in the history of Japanese patronage, where the relationship between a great lord and a distinguished artist or scholar often took a form that balanced support with the preservation of the practitioner's essential orientation. The students who came to Musashi and Kumamoto during the early 1640s were receiving instruction of a particular character. He was no longer at the physical peak of his abilities. The sustained vigor of his middle years had given way to the slower, more deliberate movement of a man past 60, and his instruction reflected this transition. Where a younger master might demonstrate technique through direct performance, Musashi in these years was more likely to explain the principle through language, through observation of his students' practice, through the kind of precise and economical commentary that identified exactly where a student's understanding had failed to penetrate below the surface of the form. The students who learned from him in this period were learning something different from what the students of his middle years had received, not less, but differently weighted, with the philosophical dimension more fully elaborated and the physical dimension present more as a vehicle for understanding than as an end in itself. His work with brush and ink during his Kumamoto years produced images that have survived in a condition sufficient to study. The painting of the shrike on a dead branch, sometimes called Koboku Meikakuzu, is among the works most frequently cited by art historians as representative of his mature approach. The bird is placed slightly off-center on the branch, its posture suggesting attention rather than rest. The branch is rendered in a few economical strokes that convey its weight and texture without laboring the description. The background is empty. The composition has the quality of arrested movement. The bird has paused, but the pause is filled with potential, and the image communicates this without theatrical gesture. The ink tones are varied with a control that reflects long practice, the gradations of wet and dry brush producing depth without the mechanical regularity that would signal technical accomplishment at the expense of direct expression. The void section of the Gorin no Sho is the briefest and, in some respects, the most philosophically ambitious. In it, Musashi gestures toward a quality of martial understanding that cannot be captured in the language of technique, form, or even principle. A condition of practice in which the distinction between the practitioner and the practice has become less fixed, in which the response to any situation arises without the friction of deliberate calculation or habituated form. This condition is described not as a destination that can be sought directly, but as something that emerges, if at all, from the thorough working through of all the preceding stages: the mastery of form that allows form to be set aside, the understanding of principle that allows principle to be forgotten. The vocabulary Musashi uses here draws on the same tradition of Zen-influenced thinking that informed his broader intellectual framework, but it applies that vocabulary to specifically martial conditions rather than to the context of sitting meditation or the performing arts, where it was more commonly employed. The text he left behind, the Gorin no Sho and the Dokudo together, represent an unusual kind of intellectual legacy. Not a system, not a doctrine, but a set of observations made from within a specific practice and offered as material for further reflection by practitioners whose own practice would be the test of what the observations meant. The Gorin no Sho does not claim to have resolved the questions it raises. It claims to have engaged with them seriously over a long period and to have arrived at formulations that might be useful to others similarly engaged. The modesty of this claim, and the confidence that underlies it, is characteristic of the tone that runs throughout both texts and is part of what has made them the objects of sustained attention in the centuries since their composition. The wider transmission of Musashi's ideas into Japanese culture followed the paths of literacy and publication. The printing of the Gorin no Sho in the early 19th century marked a transition from restricted manuscript circulation to broad availability, and the text entered the general reading culture of the late Edo period as a work of practical philosophy as well as martial instruction. The engagement of educated readers, who were not martial practitioners, with a text designed for practitioners, produced readings that emphasized the general philosophical content at the expense of the specific martial context, a tendency that accelerated as the text was translated and read beyond Japan in the 20th century. The relationship between the text as Musashi intended it and the text as subsequent readers received it is a gap that scholarship has attempted to address without fully closing. The site of Musashi's final years, the cave at Reigando in the hills above Iwato, became a place of pilgrimage within a generation of his death. The tradition of visiting the sites associated with notable figures was well established in Japanese culture, and the cave offered a particular quality of physical connection to Musashi's work. One could sit in approximately the place where he had sat to write, look out from approximately the same angle at the landscape he had looked at, and feel, if only in imagination, something of the material conditions under which the texts had been produced. Whether this kind of physical proximity to a historical site conveyed any genuine understanding of its former occupant is a question that the tradition of pilgrimage has always left open, preferring the experience itself to its theoretical justification. What the accounts do not capture, because no account could, is the texture of the interior experience of those final months. The specific quality of the attention he brought to the brushwork on the last paintings, the precise feeling in his chest as the illness deepened, the character of the silence in the cave on a winter evening with the light fading over the hills. These are the things that the historical record cannot hold, and they were not available to the students and retainers who preserved the documents that remain. They belong to the privacy of a single life, and that privacy is absolute in the way that only death makes things absolutely private. The legacy of that life has been interpreted and reinterpreted according to the needs of the periods in which the interpretation has occurred. The warrior ethic of the late Tokugawa and Meiji periods found in Musashi a model of martial dedication consistent with the ideological requirements of those eras. The competitive culture of post-war Japan found in the Gorin no Sho a manual of strategic thinking applicable to commercial as well as military contexts. The global spread of interest in Japanese martial arts and philosophy in the late 20th century found in Musashi a figure whose combination of practical mastery and philosophical depth made him an accessible point of entry into a tradition otherwise partly closed to outside approaches. Each of these readings captured something and missed something, as all readings of complex historical figures do. The hills outside the cave at Reigando are quiet now as they were quiet then. The sounds that reach the interior are the sounds of the landscape, birds, water, wind through the trees, the gradual modulation of the light. These conditions, which Musashi chose for the work of his final years, have not changed in their essential character. What was written in that silence has continued to be read across the centuries in conditions that are different in almost every respect. The gap between those two environments, the cave in the 17th century and the world in which the text is now received, is one that neither the text nor any amount of commentary can fully close. The words are on the page. What they mean continues to be a question that each reader approaches from within their own practice, whatever that practice may be. The physical environment of a practitioner's training shapes the practice in ways that are rarely made explicit. Musashi spent the majority of his active years outdoors in landscapes that varied from the crowded urban environment of Kyoto to the mountain paths between provincial towns to the coastal regions of Kyushu. This variety of physical environment, different terrain, different weather, different qualities of light and footing, produced a body that was adaptable rather than optimized for any single set of conditions. The practitioner who has trained exclusively in a formal hall develops a precise attunement to that specific environment, but this precision can become a liability in conditions that differ from those in which the training was conducted. The practitioner who is trained across many environments has sacrificed some of that precision in exchange for a more general adaptability, and Musashi's writing suggests that he valued the second quality highly, that the capacity to function well, regardless of conditions, was, for him, a more important form of readiness than any specialized excellence. The climate and topography of Japan, a mountainous archipelago with distinct seasons and significant regional variation, contributed to the conditions of Musashi's travels in ways that are worth noting even if they cannot be documented precisely. The winters of the mountain routes were severe enough to make travel genuinely demanding, and a practitioner who maintained training through the cold months of the Nakasendo passes was subjecting the body to stresses that the moderate seasons did not produce. The summer heat of the inland sea region, the humidity of the coastal provinces, the rain that the Japanese seasons delivered in concentrated periods, each of these placed specific demands on the body and on the management of the physical and mental resources that sustained practice required. The encounter between a practitioner's training and the actual conditions of its deployment was one that Musashi's years of travel had provided in an unusually varied form. His choice to travel, rather than establish himself in a single location, reflects a judgment about how martial understanding was best developed, through the diversity of encounter rather than the depth of practice, in a single context. This is a judgment with costs as well as benefits, and Musashi was not unaware of the costs. The depth of engagement with a single tradition, the quality of understanding that comes from studying under a single master over many years, the sense of belonging to a lineage. These were things his mode of development did not provide, and his writing acknowledges, obliquely, that the independence of the unattached practitioner comes at the price of certain forms of connection. The Dokodo's instruction to accept separation from every person is not only a philosophical aspiration, but a description of the actual conditions of his life, presented as a principle rather than as a loss. The transmission of the Gorin no Sho from manuscript to printed text to global readership involved a series of translations, not only between languages but between contexts, each translation carrying both the original content and the interpretive framework of the translator's situation. The first European language translations appeared in the 20th century, during a period when interest in Japanese culture had been stimulated by the encounter between Japan and the West, that the post-war situation had intensified. The translators of these early versions were working from manuscripts and early printed editions with varying degrees of access to the historical and martial context that the text assumed in its original readers, and the resulting translations inevitably reflected both the insights and the limitations of their position. Later translations, drawing on more developed scholarship about the text's historical and philosophical context, have been able to offer more nuanced readings, though the fundamental challenge of translating a text whose primary subject is an embodied practice remains. The question of what Musashi meant by the void, the fifth and final element of his five-part scheme, is one that subsequent readers have addressed through a wide range of philosophical and interpretive frameworks. Some have read it in specifically Buddhist terms as pointing toward the dissolution of the ego that Zen practice aims at. Others have read it in more pragmatic terms, as pointing toward the condition of mental clarity in which the practitioner responds to situations without the distorting effect of preconception or habituated response. Still others have emphasized the epistemological dimension, the recognition that any system of principles, however well developed, remains a partial and approximate representation of a reality that exceeds it, and that the practitioner who mistakes the map for the territory has limited their understanding in a fundamental way. These readings are not mutually exclusive, and the text itself is constructed in a way that resists any single definitive interpretation, a quality that may itself be part of the philosophical point. His appreciation for this kind of embodied, accumulated knowledge, in contrast to purely abstract or scriptural knowledge, is evident throughout the Gorin no-sho, which repeatedly invokes the example of craftsmen and artisans as illustrations of the principles he is describing. The carpenter, the smith, the builder. These figures appear in his text not as lower analogues to the swordsman, but as parallel practitioners of the same fundamental discipline, which is the discipline of learning to understand a material through sustained engagement with it, and to work with that material in a way that is responsive to its specific properties rather than imposing a predetermined form. This democratic quality in his examples, the willingness to find illustration of the deepest martial principles in the work of artisans, was unusual in a culture that maintained strict categorical distinctions between the military and artisan classes, and it reflects the degree to which his thinking had moved beyond the specific social framework of his origin. The final winter of Musashi's life, spent in the cave at Reigando as the health that had begun to fail him 2 years earlier continued its slow decline, was the winter of 1644 to 1645. The Hosokawa domain maintained its support through this period, sending provisions and ensuring that the cave's occupant had what he needed for the work he was completing. Visitors came when he was willing to receive them, students, administrators of the domain, people who had heard of his condition and wanted to pay their respects while there was still time. He received these visitors according to his capacity on any given day, and the accounts of such visits describe a man who was physically diminished, but whose attention and clarity of expression were undiminished. The writing was finished, the paintings were made, and whatever remained to be done had been done. In the years and decades following his death, the formal structures that had been established to transmit his approach gradually took on the institutional character of all long-lived traditions. The Niten Ichi Ryu became a school in the full sense, with its succession of headmasters, its certificates of transmission, its community of practitioners defined by shared lineage, and in the process of institutionalization, some of what had been most distinctive about Musashi's own approach was inevitably modified by the requirements of transmission itself. The resistance to fixed form, the emphasis on principle over technique, the preference for direct experience over inherited method. These qualities were preserved in the texts he had left behind, but their expression in actual practice was shaped by the conditions of each generation's encounter with those texts. This is the ordinary fate of any tradition that survives its founding practitioners, and it is neither failure nor betrayal, but simply the condition of continuation. The texts remained as a check on the modifications that time and circumstance introduced, a resource to which practitioners could return when the institutional forms of the tradition seemed to have departed from its source. The return to sources, the effort to understand what the founder actually meant, to recover the principles behind the forms that transmission had solidified, is a recurring movement in any living tradition, and the presence of the Gorin no-sho and the Dokodo in the tradition Musashi founded provided the material for such returns across the centuries of the tradition's subsequent history. The simplicity of what he asked of himself was not the simplicity of a man who had avoided difficulty, but of one who had passed through difficulty and arrived at a clarity that difficulty, over sufficient time and with sufficient attention, can produce. The years in which he traveled and tested himself were not simple years. They were years of physical danger, material uncertainty, and the kind of social marginality that the Japanese social order of his period made genuinely difficult to sustain. That he sustained it and used it as the conditions for the development he was pursuing reflects not exceptional gifts, but exceptional commitment to a particular way of organizing a life. That commitment is what the Dokodo preserves in its compressed and unelaborated way, the shape of a decision held across a lifetime about what mattered enough to structure everything else around it. The cave was where that decision was finally written down. The writing was not the decision itself, but its record, left for whoever came after.